Part 78. They rumored in the palace that Junhua was a fox spirit who specialized in sucking people's yang energy. The next day, Baiming Qianyu had breakfast, and before he could lie down, Leng Yi outside the door said, "Prince, Mrs. Shui is now outside the courtyard and wants to visit Prince." Nope, Baiming Qianyu didn't want to see them. He was impatient now just thinking of the concubines in the backyard. "Prince, Mrs. Shui is also worried about you. What's wrong with you seeing her?" Junhua, who was waiting on the side, was a little dissatisfied with the attitude of Baiming Qianyu. How could he say to her that Mrs. Shui was also the concubine who came back from Baiming Qianyu? How could he be so ruthless? "Ziqing, you seem to want me to see Mrs. Shui?" Baiming Qianyu's eyes were slightly cold, and his expression was gloomy. "That's not what I'm hoping for. I'm just going to talk about it objectively." Junhua really doesn't understand Baiming Qianyu more and more. Obviously Mrs. Shui is the concubine of Baiming Qianyu, and now it seems to be his. "Can't you care a little bit?" Baiming Qianyu looked frustrated. He must have been too smooth in the first half of his life, so he met Junhua and was sad for love. "Prince, you are the prince of the Yao Dynasty. You should have 3 wives and 4 concubines. How can you lose your generosity for a male concubine who can't be on the stage?" Junhua also found that Baiming Qianyu was becoming more and more stubborn, and felt that Baiming Qianyu was not simply pampering him, but deeper feelings, which made him a little flustered. Because he doesn't like to owe people something, especially feelings. "You are not allowed to say that about yourself." Baiming Qianyu looked slightly angry. In his eyes, Junhua is his other half. How can he be the male concubine who can't be on the stage? Junhua felt that things were going in a direction that he couldn't control, and he felt that he should leave Baiming Qianyu as soon as possible. It's just that the thought of disappearing into a mystery gave him a headache. Baiming Qianyu beckoned to him. Junhua hesitated for a moment, and walked to Baiming Qianyu's side. Baiming Qianyu gently took Junhua's hand and said softly, "Shen Li, I know that you like to be fubai, and I also know that you have escaped marriage, but I can ignore that. As long as you stay by my side obediently in the future, I can act as if nothing happened." Junhua, he really wanted to explain that he and Fubai really had nothing, but his identity was too embarrassing. If he let Baiming Qianyu know that he was Prince Junhua of the Holy Dynasty, he would definitely be ridiculed by Baiming Qianyu for the rest of his life, so this secret will be buried in his heart for the rest of his life. As for the future, the two of them live in different countries anyway, and they will definitely not meet again. Seeing that he was silent, a trace of panic surged up inexplicably in his heart, and his tone became fragile. "Ziqing, it's impossible for you and Fubai anyway. Can you forget him and accept my love? I can assure you that I will love you alone in this life." Junhua's heart was touched. What a beautiful declaration of love. It was heartwarming. But who knows what the future holds? He has seen several pairs of dead and alive people he once loved, and finally changed his mind. This kind of love story is still useful to deceive people who are not deeply involved in the world. But for him, it is good to listen to it, because he will not fall into a place of no return. He sat on the edge of the bed, looked soft, and replied, "Good." He got a positive answer. Baiming Qianyu was not as happy as he imagined, because he felt indifference and alienation in Junhua. He really wanted to cut Junhua's body with a knife to see if his heart was made of stone. In the end, Baiming Qianyu didn't see Mrs. Shui. He took Junhua's hand and enjoyed the world of the two. And Mrs. Shui, who was outside the courtyard, learned that the prince was not seeing her. And her pretty little face instantly became gloomy, and she walked towards her courtyard with angry steps. seeing that she was about to arrive at her small courtyard. A woman in a goose yellow dress blocked her way. Looking at the graceful woman in front of her, Mrs. Shui's already bad mood became even worse, and she asked with a cold face, "Sister Nian, is there something wrong with you?" Mrs. Nian replied with a smile, "Sister Shui, this is to see the prince. How is the prince's health?" "How do I know?" Thinking that the prince didn't see her, Mrs. Shui's face became more and more gloomy. "Huh." Mrs. Nian looked surprised. "Sister, didn't you go to see the prince? How can you not know how the prince is doing?" Mrs. Shui looked at Mrs. Nian with a surprised face, and thought that Mrs. Nian was laughing at her for not seeing the prince, so she was so angry that her face turned hideous, and she scolded angrily. The prince was fascinated by Shen Li's slut, and now there is only Shen Li in his eyes, and there is no us at all. Although Mrs. Shui did not directly say that the prince did not see her, Mrs. Nian knew that Mrs. Shui did not see the prince, and she couldn't help but feel a trace of fear in her heart. She was afraid that the prince would be completely infatuated with Shen Li, and then forget them all. She had always thought that the prince was just trying to be so good to Shen Li because of freshness, but now that she looks at it, it doesn't seem to be freshness, but more like love. Mrs. Shui's expression was gloomy. She ignored Mrs. Nian on the side, and walked towards her small courtyard. Back in the room, before she could sit down and take a sip of tea, the maid Shaolian walked in and said respectfully, "Madam, Mrs. Ru is here." Hearing Mrs. Ru, Mrs. Shui frowned unconsciously. Mrs. Ru was born with an innocent face, but she was scheming and ruthless. If she wanted anyone to die, she would have to die, and even the 2 wives of the prince died in the hands of that woman. But, what about knowing? I have no evidence to prove that the 2 princesses were killed by Mrs. Ru. Who will believe it? Maybe it will cause her to be killed. Therefore, in the face of Mrs. Ru, she pretended to be stupid and stunned, and never dared to do anything against Mrs. Ru. But, thinking that Shen Li has monopolized the prince for a period of time, he must have touched Mrs. Ru's scales, and Mrs. Ru should find a way to kill Shen Li. Thinking of this, the fear in her heart dissipated a lot, and she said to Shaolian, "Please." Whoa! Shaolian turned to leave. And after a while, she led a woman in a blue palace dress in. The woman is good-looking, with delicate facial features, fair and smooth skin, tall figure, and a blue palace dress sets her off like a quiet orchid in the empty valley. "Sister meets my sister." Mrs. Ru blessed herself slightly and bowed. Mrs. Shui stood up politely. With an easygoing expression, "Sister Ru, this is my sister's courtyard as my own, just feel free." "Thank you, sister." Mrs. Ru always had a decent smile on her face, looking harmless to humans and animals. "Come on, Sister Ru, let's sit down and talk." Although Mrs. Shui was a little scared in the face of Mrs. Ru, she still tried her best to look amiable. She waited for Mrs. Ru to sit down before she sat down, and then asked politely, "Why does my sister have time to talk to this sister today?" Mrs. Ru had a touch of sorrow on her face. "Sister heard that my sister went to visit the prince this morning, but you were rejected by the prince. My sister's true feelings for the prince can be learned. But the prince bullied my sister so much for a male concubine, and the sister felt worthless for my sister from the bottom of my heart." Mrs. Shui sneered in her heart. This Mrs. Ru was distressed for her sister in the left sentence, and her sister was not worth it in the right sentence, and she thought that Mrs. Ru was really thinking about her if she didn't know it. But she is not stupid. Now Shen Li is the time to be favored. If she deals with Shen Li at this time, she will definitely be given a white silk by the prince, and Mrs. Jing in front is the best example. Therefore, she is not in a hurry, and after the prince does not favor Shenli, she will slowly clean up Shenli. Thank my sister cares, but after all, Brother Shen has only been in the palace for more than a month, and he doesn't understand the rules of the palace, which is understandable. Mrs. Shui replied with a smile. She would not be so stupid and be used by Mrs. Ru. A trace of disdain flashed in Mrs. Ru's eyes, and she secretly scolded Mrs. Shui for being too timid to deal with Shen Li. Although she was unhappy in her heart, she didn't show it at all, and she still looked like I was thinking about my sister Shui. Sister is just afraid that Brother Shen will be pampered and coquettish, and when the time comes, he will bully my sister. If my sister is afraid that Brother Shen will not be easy to deal with, this sister can help my sister punish Brother Shen a little, so that he knows the rules of the Wanyu Palace. Mrs. Shui was interested, and she didn't know how Mrs. Ru wanted to deal with Shen Li. So she asked curiously, Sister has a way to punish Brother Shen? Mrs. Ru responded obediently, and then said, This Shen Li has only been in the palace for more than a month. But he has fascinated the prince. How can this person do it? He is clearly a fox spirit from the mountains, possessed by Shen Li, and wants to suck the prince's yang energy. Mrs. Ru knew that the most taboo thing for the royal family was demons and monsters. If they rumored in the palace that Shen Li was a fox spirit who specialized in sucking people's yang energy, the prince would definitely be jealous of Shen Li after hearing it, so he would no longer favor Shen Li. Mrs. Shui's eyes lit up. Yes, secretly slandering Shen Li. Won't the prince slowly alienate Shen Li? It's just that, thinking that if the prince didn't believe it, but investigated the matter for Shen Li, wouldn't the first unlucky person be herself? For a while, she hesitated. If the prince doesn't believe it, what should I do if they find out about this matter in the palace? Mrs. Ru felt that Mrs. Shui was a little unmoved. So stupid it seemed that she was not suitable to be her teammate in the future, only suitable to be a stepping stone. Although she thought so in her heart, she still whispered, Sister, how can you let you do this kind of thing? Aren't there 2 maids in Mrs. Nian's courtyard who used to be in your courtyard? You let those 2 girls pass it on, even if the prince checks it out. Isn't it Mrs. Nian who is the first to find out? A glimmer of light flashed in Mrs. Shui's eyes, and she secretly praised Mrs. Ru, who was worthy of killing the 2 princesses. And she could think of such a damaging trick. At that time, no matter which side the prince stands, 1 person will be removed. After sending Mrs. Ru away, she immediately sent her most trusted maid and asked her to go to Mrs. Nian's courtyard, and asked the 2 little girls to spread that Shen Li was a fox spirit in the mountains. And Mrs. Shui went to visit the prince, but the prince did not see the news of her in the palace. They all privately discussed what means Shen Li used to let the prince only favor him. Just as everyone was quietly discussing the matter, another piece of news spread. Some people say that Shen Li is the fox who has cultivated in the mountains for thousands of years, specializing in possessing others and sucking other people's yang energy, and this time he just picked Shen Li and attached himself to Shen Li, so as to take the opportunity to suck the yang energy of the prince. For a while, the people in the palace were panicked, and everyone hid away in fear when they saw Junhua. Fearing that Junhua would suck their yang energy. This young master Shen really has a hand, and he is so fascinated that the prince who never touches a man is fascinated, and for him, even the wives don't want it. I've seen this young master Shen before, he looks really handsome. I see, this young master Shen is a person, he is clearly a fox in the mountains. He took a fancy to the prince's pure yang energy, and deliberately attached himself to young Master Shen to absorb the prince's yang energy. In the firewood room, the 2 little guys couldn't help but talk about Junhua. I think so. When I see young Master Shen in the future, stay away. Be careful not to be sucked dry by him. Not really. The two little guys hugged the firewood, walked out of the firewood room with a worried face, and walked towards the kitchen. And after they left, a man dressed in black jumped down from the beam of the room. His eyes looked indifferently at the two backs walking away, and then one dodged and ran quickly towards Jing Yashwen. In Baiming Qianyu's room, there was only one person in Baiming Qianyu at this time. He looked at the black-clothed man who came to the room like a ghost, and he didn't have a trace of surprise. And asked indifferently, "How did the house pass on Ziqing?" The man in black looked respectful, and replied with his fists clenched, "Back to the prince." Most of the people in the palace are rumoring that young Master Shen is a mountain fox and wants to suck your young energy. Baiming Qianyu was amused. These people are really idle and boring. And they can think of such outrageous things. Then his eyes turned cold. Has anyone found out about it? Prince, my subordinates have checked. The rumors came out of Mrs. Nian's small courtyard. And the rumors have become more and more outrageous in the past few days. And the people in the entire palace are talking about this matter. The man in black truthfully reported the news he had heard to Baiming Qianyu. These concubines are becoming more and more restless now, and they even make up these ridiculous remarks in order to compete for favor. Baiming Qianyu's expression was gloomy and terrifying. And killing intent flashed in his eyes. The man in black saw that Baiming Qianyu was moved by murderous intentions, and he dared to persuade, "Prince, no matter what the ladies say. They are all your former women, you can't do it for young Master Shen." He didn't dare to say anything more about the words he said later, because at this time, Baiming Qianyu exuded a cold killing intent, which scared him so much that he didn't dare to say it anymore. Suddenly, Baiming Qianyu was full of murderous intent, and said slowly, "Wu Feng. How do you think this prince can dismiss all the concubines in the palace without causing dissatisfaction among everyone? Although Mrs. Shui and the others are all concubines. They are all daughters of the big families of the Riyao dynasty. If he doesn't find a better excuse to dismiss Mrs. Shui and the others, I am afraid that it will be true, and when the time comes, it will cause a bloody storm if these families are dissatisfied. As for letting Leng Yi dismiss Mrs. Shui before, it was completely a threat to Junhua, but Junhua was too naive and actually fooled." Wu Feng was stunned for a moment, and then said with a serious face, "Prince, no. The situation in the court in China is already turbulent now. If you suddenly dismiss Mrs. Shui and them, it will definitely cause dissatisfaction among these families, and if they resist at that time, I am afraid that it will be unfavorable to you, Prince." This is what Baiming Qianyu is worried about. If he suddenly dismisses the concubines in the house, it will definitely cause the dissatisfaction of those families. There is also the Baiming sticks who is not in line with him. If the Baiming sticks and those big clans join forces to reason him, he will definitely parry. Thinking of Baiming Shao, Baiming Qianyu's expression became more and more gloomy. This stinky boy with a wolf's heart and dog's lungs, if it weren't for the fact that he was the only heir of the emperor's brother, he really wanted to leave Baiming Shao, leave the court, and take his Ziqing to live the life of the idle cloud and wild crane. He propped his head on his hands, thinking about how to make Baiming Shao see who the person who really wanted to harm him was. Junhua didn't know the troubles of Baiming Qianyu. After he washed up, he changed into clean clothes and went out. As soon as he walked out of the door, Luju, who was waiting outside the door, stopped him with a worried expression. "Young master, recently there have been rumors in the palace that you are a fox who has cultivated in the mountains. If you let this matter ferment, the slave is afraid that it will have an impact on you, young master." If you want a lot of masters, you should persuade the prince. Let the prince meet Mrs. Shui and them. This incident was originally caused by the jealousy of the backyard. As long as the prince is wet with rain and dew, these problems will be solved. Yes, young master. You better persuade the prince more. Liu Yan on the side also looked worried. Now it's just the palace to spread this matter again. If it is allowed to ferment, it will be the entire capital to spread this matter, and everyone will know about it when the time comes. And the prince will definitely kill Junhua to appease people's hearts in order to block the carefree mouths. Ever since Junhua knew that people could induce thunder and lightning, he no longer believed that there were gods in this world. However, the people of the Riyao dynasty don't know that if this matter is allowed to ferment, he will definitely be pushed to the fire by the angry masses and burned alive. The horror of being burned alive broke out in a cold sweat. Wait a minute. I'll persuade the prince. Thinking of Baiming Qianyu's stubborn character, Junhua only felt a sudden pain in his temples.